All right, these two videos are going to walk you through the next section of our notes. We've already completed Italy, the birthplace of the Renaissance and the Northern Renaissance. This is going to guide you through the sections entitled Luther Leads the Reformation and the Reformation Continues. All right, so if we look at this, this is all about the Reformation. These are our two topics in this unit, the Renaissance, the Reformation. Let's start off with the definition of the term Reformation. And that is a 16th century movement for the reform of abuses in the Roman Catholic Church, ending in the establishment of the Reformed and Protestant churches. So that's a mouthful, but basically, it's the movement to, as the name implies, reform church practices that have been established and gotten a little bit corrupt in the time leading up to the Reformation. All right, another thing that made the Reformation possible was the Renaissance. And so there's a couple things that happened in the Renaissance that kind of paved the way for the Reformation. The first one's a little bit long, but that's okay. We can fill it in. Number one is the Renaissance focusing on things that were secular, and the individual person inadvertently challenged the church's authority. Like we saw in some of the artwork we looked at, the topics were not exclusively religious anymore, topics of art. And so if art maybe wasn't going to be exclusively religious, then maybe other things could stand to be excluded from religion or separate from religion. Right? And then because the church emphasized so much individuals' role in society, the Renaissance, which focused more on your individual worth, it was an inadvertent challenge of church authority and church teaching. So maybe that opened the door to reformers like Luther. Also, the printing press brought to Europe, that technology allowed ideas of the Reformation to spread around Europe and to people a lot faster than if the printing press hadn't been invented. So that was a unique time to be able to spread new ideas. Thirdly, right, there were some rulers, like one we're going to see in the section here, that were standing up to the church, who had to be submissive to the church, who were under the authority of the church, and started to think that they'd like to be the highest ranking official in their nation. So there was some political and religious strife going on in Europe as well. And then last but not least, this one's a bit more controversial. It takes a sort of a pessimistic approach to religion. Some contend that there were some wealthy people that didn't like the amount of taxes they were paying, and so their frustration with the church was based more on a financial reason than it was a spiritual one, which I guess is possible, but that's a very pessimistic view of religion. I think most people who are religious probably don't mind paying money to the church because that's part of their reasonable act of worship to the Lord, but some historians feel this way. All right, before the really famous leaders like Luther and like Calvin, there was a couple of reformers that came before that paved the way for much more famous reformers. So this first guy is John Wycliffe. All right, he was famous for his translation of the Bible into ordinary languages. There's still a organization, missionary organization in the world today who's called the Wycliffe Bible Translators, and they go throughout the world translating the Bible into remote languages based on some of the work that Wycliffe did himself while he was alive. All right, so next to the reformer's name, just put a hyphen, and then I want you to put what they did to set the stage for the Reformation. It should be a number 2, or number 3, yeah. So we have 2 is the name, 3 is the action, I guess you could say. So I guess you don't need the hyphen. You just write their name in 2, and in the corresponding letter in 3, write the ideas that they advocated. So 2A and 3A should go together, and 2B and 3B should go together. So Wycliffe denied that the Pope had the right to worldly power. The contention of the church at the time was the Pope was God, or God's representative, flawless representative on earth, and it was infallible, never sinned, things like that. And Wycliffe was one of the first to suggest that that may not be the case. All right, another early reformer in a different part of Europe was named John Huss. So this is 2b, John Huss. And then under 3b, right in, he started to teach that the Bible had more authority than church tradition. Imagine that. But he suggested that, and then the next thing I'm going to show you here, this is an image, a recreation, a piece of art illustrating the Catholic Church's response to Huss's suggestion that the Bible had more authority than the church leaders and the church tradition. There it is. No thank you, says the church. So John Huss was burned at the stake for his heretic beliefs. The church claimed they wouldn't listen to him. They didn't allow him to speak. But apparently he died singing praise songs. So you would think it'd be a horrible, horrific death, but he seemed to be at peace about it. All right, time went on and church corruption continued. This guy right here is a good example of church corruption. His name is John Tetzel. He was hired by the church to go throughout Europe and sell indulgences. And the money from those indulgences was to repair St. Peter's Basilica and just to bring in some revenue so that the church could use the money to be able to maintain the empire, so to speak. All right, an indulgence, we look in the vocabulary section, vocab term number 1. An indulgence is a way to reduce the amount of punishment one has to undergo for sins in this world or the next. So the recipient could buy a slip of paper, that's called the indulgence, and by doing so, they would have alleviated some of the punishment they'd have to do to cancel out their sin. Or they could buy an indulgence for a relative to get out of purgatory, which is the in-between place between alive and dead before you get to heaven. It's after you're dead, but before you get into heaven. So these were on sale. So individuals, not just Luther, but Luther's the one who was the most active about it, was displeased with this practice of the church. And the reason for that is, to Luther, it was like the church was selling forgiveness. And you'll see in the video clip about Luther is when he searched through the scriptures, he found that forgiveness is something that God offered for free. So it really, really upset him and offended him that the church was trying to sell that forgiveness and make a profit off of it. And that kind of motivated him, maybe the last straw, to push him over the edge to actually act out against the church. And then what he did, famously, which you've probably heard of before, is he wrote down his issues, indulgences included, and wrote them all out and put them on the door of the church at Wittenberg. And this was a place, as you can see in the picture here, where a lot of messages were put because everybody went to church, so everybody would see it. So this is a way of having your ideas be expressed to everyone. That's why you put it on the church door. All right, there's a couple of ideas expressed within these theses that are of significance for Christianity going forward. One such belief was that people were saved by faith and receiving God's forgiveness. So as opposed to some of the works things that the church was saying people had to do, you had to take communion, you had to go to church, you had to. Very similar to what we talked about in chapel the other day about idols and what they require. A second component was the belief that church teaching should point back to the scriptures, to the Bible. The Bible's the source, not church tradition, not the church leaders, and they should all comply with what the Bible says about what they're doing and what they're teaching. The Bible should be the standard. That's another thing that Luther suggested. A lot of activity in the church was, well, we've always done it this way, or we believe this is really important. Luther disagreed with that sort of thinking. And then thirdly, Luther felt like people should not have to hear the Bible from somebody else, especially in a language that they didn't understand. They didn't need priests to forgive their sin. They could have free access to God, and he believed that they did not need someone else to tell them what the Bible said. And that is fleshed out later in his life, where he really believed people should read the Bible for themselves. That's what impacted him. He felt like that should be impactful to others as well. All right. Like some of these other earlier reformers, Luther was brought in for a conversation. His went a little bit better than John Huss's. This is a picture here of Luther being brought in to face all the church leaders and explain himself. They told him he was wrong. He said he wasn't. He told them the scripture that supported his beliefs. They disagreed. They didn't have him executed. They chose instead to have him banished as an outlaw. And being labeled an outlaw means that in this time, all of your legal protection is gone. So someone could have killed him and not be held legally responsible for that. But luckily, he had a powerful friend who picked him up after this meeting before anything could happen to him. By the way, this meeting was in the city of Worms. There's his friend. His friend was named Frederick the Wise, ironically enough, picked him up before he could be hurt, hid him in his castle, and from there Luther did some more work to promote the Reformation ideas. The most important thing he probably did was translate the Bible into German so the people living in the country that he was from could read the Bible for themselves. So they didn't have to take the word of anyone else. They could read it for themselves and have their own personal relationship with God. All right, so this is all going on in Germany, across the water, a little bit to the north and to the west in England. There's also some controversy brewing, and it sort of connects inadvertently in a different way to the Reformation. All right, England has a king, and this is, I'm getting ahead of myself. Apologize. Before we get to the king, we're going to talk about how peasants in Germany decided that while Luther was talking about freedom from spiritual bondage, they wanted freedom from the political bondage they had to their leaders. So they jumped on his ideas and they used it as an excuse to, riot and fight against their kings and their princes, an act that Luther condemned, but that's how his ideas were interpreted. All right, back to England, because I think that's the more interesting part of the story anyway, but this is the King of England. Where'd he go? There he is. This is Henry VIII. And Henry VIII was married to Catherine of Aragon. She was the daughter of the King of Spain, who was a relative of the Pope. Spain is the strongest, most dominant country in the world. They happen to be very, very Catholic, passionately Catholic, related to the Pope. And he was married to her, and he decided that it was her fault that they didn't have any male sons, so he wanted to annul his marriage, which is a fancy way of saying erase it like it never existed. So he reached out to the Pope and wanted to look for a way to get rid of his marriage. His wife was the daughter of the most powerful Catholic king in the world. The Pope said no, probably a little more harsh than just no. But Henry VIII wasn't the type of person who would just accept no as an answer. He's a tad arrogant. And plus, he's already thinking that it's his wife's fault that he doesn't have a male son, so he's already not thinking straight. So he decides, rather than accept the decision of the Pope, that he would change the religion of his entire country and not be Catholic anymore. He jumped on this idea of the Reformation that was happening in Germany and decided England will be Protestant going forward, and then he could divorce his wife. So they passed a law called the Act of Supremacy. This made Henry the head of the church instead of the Pope, and Henry gave himself the authority to divorce his wife. And then he married Anne Boleyn and still didn't have any sons, and then got rid of her, and Henry VIII is known as not being very kind to his wives. He had most of them executed. But the side story is that England became Protestant because Henry VIII wanted to divorce his wife. And if you take that further and further, act to act to act to act, you see that as time passed, some people felt like the church was still too Catholic. They wanted to be more Protestant, so they left. And they went over to Holland. That was still too sinful for them, so they went across the Atlantic Ocean and they started a new settlement in the New World, which became Plymouth, and they brought with them this freedom of religion that traces all the way back to Henry VIII wanting to divorce his wife. So we have freedom of religion in this country because Henry VIII wanted to divorce his wife. It's kind of a weird connection, but you can trace the two statements back to each other. All right, real quick, the church that they set up in England was called the Anglican Church. So if you look back at the vocab words, vocab word 5, Anglican, that is the denomination of Protestantism that existed in England. And then just I'm going to give you verbally here the other two definitions. Lutheran. Lutheran is anyone who follows the doctrine and the teaching of Luther. Makes sense. And Protestant is anyone who follows the Protestant doctrine as opposed to the Catholic doctrine. So those are pretty easy to define. I didn't write them down for you, but telling you they're simple enough that I think we can just do it that way.